I had imagined that Thanksgiving evening 100 times in my head, the smell of roasted turkey filling the house I built with my own hands. My daughter Henrietta laughing in the kitchen, flour on her cheek like when she was 10. My son-in-law, Leonard, carving the turkey while pretending he knew what he was doing. Grandkids running around, the sound of a home that still had love in it. Matt was what I expected. What I got instead was humiliation, a kind that cut deep enough to change a man forever. The drive to their house was short, barely 10 minutes, but each minute felt longer than the last. The November wind was sharp, the kind that bit through your jacket and made you wonder if warmth was something you'd imagined. I remember gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing what I'd say when I saw Henrietta. Afghanistan, it had been months since she last called. Maybe this dinner would fix things. Maybe I could finally say, "I miss you, honey." Willingness, maybe we could talk about her mother again without both of us breaking down. When I turned into the driveway, I slowed down. 3 cars were already there, shiny, expensive, parked at crooked angles. Traffic at his car family drives when they're visiting an old man for Thanksgiving. Abolish. No, these were the cars of people who came to show off. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the lights glowing through the front windows. Airflow floated through the cold air. Laughter, the clink of glasses. It was 5 sharp, the time Henrietta told me to come. I walked up the path I had poured myself 30 years ago, back when my wife, Lillian, was still alive. She used to say, "Every nail you hammer into this place carries a piece of your heart, Alton." And she was right. That house was built with my hands, my sweat, and my love. I knocked on the door. Simmons. No answer. Inside, someone laughed. A man's voice, loud, confident, a little too familiar. I knocked again, harder this time. The door swung open. Leonard filled the frame like he owned the place. 6'2", broad shoulders, expensive sweater that probably cost more than my truck's insurance. His cologne hit me before his words did. "You're late," he said, his lips curling slightly. Flooring. "No, I'm right on time. 5 o'clock. He glanced over his shoulder. His eyes had that look, the kind people get when they're calculating how much of your dignity they can take before you push back. "We're in the middle of things," he said. "Henrietta invited you for 5, but you know how these things go." His eyes. "It's 5. He hesitated. Then, with the grace of someone doing me a favor he didn't want to, he stepped aside. "Fine, come in." I stepped over the threshold and stopped cold. The dining room, my dining room, was full of strangers. Shameful. Maybe 9 people I had never seen before, all young, all dressed like they'd come from some magazine shoot. They sat around my old oak table, the one I had sanded and refinished last spring when Henrietta said she wanted to make the place nice. The table was covered with food: turkey, green bean casserole, sweet potatoes, rolls, the works. IMG, every chair was taken. Henrietta appeared from the kitchen, carrying a serving bowl. She froze when she saw me. I saw my little girl again, freckles, shy smile, the one who used to fall asleep on my lap watching old cowboy movies. But then her face hardened, polite but cold. "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart," I said softly. "Hi, Dad," she said, barely audible. Crimson brushed past me, his shoulder bumping mine. Not an accident. Crimson, he went straight to the table, placed his hand on the back of a chair and looked at me with fake sympathy. "What are just about to eat," he said. "You showed up at an awkward time." "The invitation said 5, I replied. My voice was calm, even. "It's 5, he said, smirking. One of his friends, a guy with a trimmed beard and a wine glass in hand, raised it slightly toward me, like he was toasting a joke only he understood. A woman beside him whispered something, and they both smiled. The room smelled like wine and expensive perfume. It didn't smell like family. Like looked around again. Every chair occupied, every place setting taken. "Where should I sit?" I asked quietly. Pharrell, no one moved. Leonard tilted his head, pretending to think. "That's a good question." Someone chuckled under their breath. A woman in a red sweater said awkwardly, "Maybe we can squeeze in another chair." Leonard held up a hand. No need. His tone changed, sharp, deliberate. I've got the perfect spot. He disappeared into the kitchen, the sound of drawers opening, cabinets slamming. Henrietta stood still, gripping the serving bowl like she wanted to disappear. Her eyes darted toward me, then away again. Leonard came back out, holding a white plastic plate, cheap, flimsy, the kind used at kids' birthday parties. His walk past the dining table, past all his friends, and placed it on the floor near the front door. Right there, on the hardwood floor I had installed myself. He scooped a few pieces of dried-out turkey onto it, added some stuffing, a spoonful of gravy that had already congealed. He did it slowly, methodically, like he'd planned every second of it. He straightened up, smiled, and said, "Right here works for you." The room went dead silent. Not one moved. The only sound was someone's uneasy breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I looked at the plate, then at Leonard, then at Henrietta. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. "Giving you exactly what you deserve," Leonard said, crossing his arms. "You always said you weren't picky." Bedsman let out a short laugh, until Leonard shot him a look. Henrietta's face had gone pale. Her knuckles were white around the bowl she still held. She couldn't even meet my eyes. That silence hurt more than anything Leonard had done. I looked back down at that plate, on the floor, positioned like food for a dog. The smell of cheap plastic and cold gravy filled the air. The house settled around me, the furnace clicking on, the refrigerator humming, the sounds of a home that used to mean peace. Now it sounded like betrayal. 30 years ago, I had built that table. I'd saved for years to buy the wood, spent nights sanding it until my hands blistered. Every scratch, every mark on its surface told a story of family dinners, birthdays, and the laughter of a little girl who used to sit at the head of it when her mother baked her favorite cherry pie. And now, strangers sat there, laughing at me behind polite smiles. Old Alton, the man I used to be, would have tried to laugh it off, would have made some joke about, "Guess I'm eating with the dog tonight." He would have carried that plate outside and pretended everything was fine. But old Alton died when my wife did. The man stand anymore. I felt something heavy inside me shift, like a door I'd kept locked for years finally creaked open. I looked up, met Leonard's eyes, and for the first time in years I smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even an angry one, just quiet. I bent down, picked up the plate, and set it gently on the table, right in front of him. "This missing me a seat," I said. He looked thrown for a second, unsure whether to laugh or glare. I turned to my daughter. "You look tired, Henrietta. You should rest more." Then, without another word, I walked out of the house I built, the house they had poisoned with arrogance. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it felt good, clean. Behind me I heard voices, whispers, laughter trying to patch over the awkwardness. Leonard's voice, smug again, saying something about old habits dying hard. I didn't listen. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away. The cut through the darkness, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel broken. I felt quiet, focused, because I knew something they didn't. His still owned more of that house than they realized, and I was going to make sure they never forgot who built it, or who they had just humiliated. Sixth, that night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the smaller one in my apartment downtown, and stared at the old family photos I'd kept. Henrietta as a child, holding a hammer next to me as we built her treehouse. Lillian laughing as the wind blew flour into her hair while baking. They used to be my world. Now, they were my motivation. Me in front of his friends was a show of power. But he had no idea that my silence was sharper than any argument, any curse. My silence was planning something. The next morning, when the sun rose over the frosted grass, I already had a list written in front of me. Names, numbers, lawyers, county records. If Thanksgiving was the day my family turned their backs on me, communion would be the day I started turning the world back around. And this time, there would be no mercy. The morning after Thanksgiving felt like the morning after a storm that hadn't ended. The sky was a flat, hard gray, and the grass in front of my little apartment was dusted with frost that crunched like brittle old paper under my boots. My truck's heater coughed and warmed the steering wheel in slow, reluctant waves, and I watched my breath hang for a little while in front of me like a pale, stubborn ghost. It was too quiet for a house that had just been the scene of something that would keep a man awake for a long time. I didn't go home to sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the small round one that had lived in my apartment for years, and I made a list. Names, dates, little facts that felt like tools. The date the deed was signed, the name of the mortgage company, the address of the county courthouse, the number for the assessor's office. I wrote slowly, the way you write when you want your thoughts to be exact and durable. I dated the list. I circled things. I underlined others. Old Alton would have been embarrassed by paperwork. He liked to do things by feel, by handshake, by the weight of a man's eye contact. But that man had also been the kind to hand over the last of his savings for a daughter's tuition and to fix a neighbor's roof without speaking of it. Lillian used to joke that I kept the world together with duct tape and stubbornness. Now, though, I needed receipts and forms. The world answers to signatures and stamps, not to stubbornness. I drove out to the county records office before it opened. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the building looked like any other civic structure, humble, built with beige bricks and a line of bald flagpoles out front. I went in and paid the small fee for a copy of the property deed. The clerk was a woman with blue reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, who moved like she had done everything at this counter 1,000 times. When she placed the Xerox in front of me, the paper smelled faintly of toner and coffee. The signature line had my name on it. So did Henrietta's, next to mine, in a looping script. I read the deed twice, then I read it again. It was not as simple as Leonard had made me feel when he shoved that plastic plate on the floor. The deed had been redone 10 years ago, yes, after Lillian died. I remembered the meeting at the lawyer's office. It had been cold that day, the windows fogged at the corners. The lawyer had recommended we add survivorship. It makes things easier, he'd said. It avoids probate. Lillian had squeezed my hand until I felt the skin creak slightly. We'll be careful, she'd said. We were careful, we thought. We had thought we had been very careful. But being careful is not the same as being airtight. Somewhere in the paperwork shuffle, the proper boxes hadn't been checked. Somewhere in the shuffle, there was a misfiled document, a misunderstood clause. And somewhere, more importantly, there was a mortgage payment that Henrietta and Leonard had failed to make on time. No, that wasn't quite it. There was an accountant who had misread something, and a letter they had thought they could ignore. The point was this: the house belonged to both my name and hers, yes, but legal ownership has teeth you can't see until you press on it. And when I pressed, carefully, quietly, the teeth showed themselves. I didn't shout. I didn't plot loudly. The thing about this kind of fight is that it rewards patience more than fury. I called an old friend of mine, a lawyer named Martinez who'd helped my sister once when her business had gone sideways. He picked up on the second ring and, when I told him briefly what had happened the night before, he didn't laugh. That was when I knew I might be on the right path. He asked a few precise questions, said he'd look into the public record and call me back. He didn't promise fireworks, just an attention to fact. While I waited, I did things other men might forget to do. I emptied the shed in the back of my apartment complex and took inventory of tools, hand saws, a box of old nails, a cordless drill with a battery that still held a charge. I went to the hardware store and bought a new lock set and an extra chain for my front door. I took photographs of the house, the front steps, the grain of the wood on the porch rail, the tiny nick in the banister where my daughter had once carved her initials as a child. I took pictures of the table from the outside through the front window, the same table they'd used as a stage for their cruelty. In the afternoon, Martinez called back. His voice was dry but steady. "You have more rights than you think," he said, "but it depends. There are a few things to confirm." He walked me through a short list: the deed copy, utility bills, anything that showed continuous occupancy or contribution to the mortgage. "It's not about proving love, Mr. Alton," he said. "It's about proving your stake. Your actions, paperwork, payments, hands-on maintenance, courts-like evidence. He recommended a title search, thorough, and said he could get an injunction if things looked favorable. He didn't promise a homecoming parade. He promised accuracy. The thing that hurt the most was the quiet weight of betrayal. People talk about betrayal like it is a single crack that runs through trust and splits it. But betrayal is more like erosion, a slow wearing away of the bank until the river eats it up. Henrietta had been my partner in sanding kitchen cabinets, in arguing over which paint color looked warm and which was too stark. She had once told me she wanted flowers in the yard that her mother had liked. She had once fallen asleep at the table with her head on her hands while I read aloud from some dog-eared paperback. When did she start thinking of me as an inconvenience? When did her loyalty curdle into a polite avoidance? And ends. The answer, I suspected, was little. If ye did not know, but of course, the special is what we will lang with it, which is a pyramidal on the loss of spec, which comes to be the term. In this COVID, the answer she thought was steady and impressive. The night she stayed late at some internship, now a career, that required a shorthand for success. New shoes, new friends, new priorities. Add to that the cover of his ego and the slow pressure of debt. People remap their moral geography over time. Small compromises become roads they drive on without looking back. But what I wanted wasn't just to point fingers. I wanted them to remember what it felt like to be where I had been placed on that floor, to feel the texture of someone else's contempt. Not as cruelty for cruelty's sake, but as a corrective. People who wear cruelty like a coat need a mirror held up to it. I made calls. I pulled up old bank statements. I found canceled checks I had written years ago to pay for roof repairs, for kitchen appliances, for new gutters after a storm. Those receipts weren't sentimental. They were legal proof of investment and care. Martinez told me to scan them and send them over. He wanted into the county office files to see if any liens had been placed and whether there had been any notice given for foreclosure or transfer. He moved like a man used to untangling knots. Benz, there was one particular afternoon that remains vivid. I took the county assessor's printout and sat in my truck idling at a light on Main Street, and I called Henrietta's number. It went to voicemail. I hadn't planned to call. I had planned to find her and speak privately, but grief and anger make for clumsy travelers. I left a short message. Hen, call me when you can. We need to talk. I didn't mention the plate. I didn't threaten. I just asked her to call. Dismissing. She didn't call back. She texted later that night. A polite clipped. Dad, I'm sorry about last night. Things got out of hand. We can talk soon. The words meant very little without the action behind them. Apologies without action are like a patch on a roof that doesn't take the rain side into account. Overwatch. Over the next several days, I worked methodically. Martinez filed a request for a quiet title action to clear up the records and requested copies of any transfers, mortgages, or liens in the past decade. We paid fees. We wrote statements. I met an assessor who told me, in a tone that tried to be gentle, that legal ownership and practical possession are different things. Possession is noisy. Ownership can be paperwork buried in a file cabinet. While the legal thing moved slow, I did other things in parallel. Small acts that mattered in their own practical ways. I called the gas company and updated records about meter readings. I called the electric company and asked if there had been any recent changes in billing address. I sent certified letters to the house with notices asking for documentation of payments and copies of any statements. I didn't expect them to return the letters with courtesy. I expected them to ignore paper that was not in their favor. I also began to prepare in ways that had nothing to do with law. I repaired the screen door at my apartment, oiled its hinges so it wouldn't creak when I came and went. I fixed the broken step at the back entrance of my little place. I mended the hem on a coat I rarely wore because it made me look older than I wanted. I made myself orderly. When you plan to take something back piece by piece, chaos is the only thing that will betray you. At night, I sat with old photos and a cup of coffee, too long gone cold. The pictures always surprised me. How bright she had been as a child. How she had once rested her head on my shoulder as if the whole world could compress into that small space between us. I wondered what it would take for the daughter in those images to look at me the way the girl in the pictures did. Memory is a powerful tool and a dangerous one. It can fuel righteous acts, or it can drown you in what-ifs. Then, a small break. Martinez called with a piece of news that made my stomach fold tightly like a fist. There was a notice on the public docket from a year earlier. A mortgage modification and a transfer filed in the name of a limited liability company. The paper trail stopped there. The company's registered agent had an out-of-state address. That's when you know someone is trying to make a thing harder than it needs to be. But the deed still bore our names. The title company had placed a temporary hold on some proceedings because of a lien dispute. In short, there was a way in. Not a simple way, but a legal, documented, lawful way. "You understand this won't be quick," Martinez warned over the phone. "And I'm not making promises about what a judge will do. But there are rights here. We can protect them." I understood. I also understood better than most that people like Leonard count on time and inertia. He counted on my age as if it were a worn-out coin. He assumed that a man my age would not have the fuel to fight the long fight. He thought humiliation would anchor me like a stone. He didn't know how long I could wait. He didn't know how carefully I could plan. Odd side effect of the whole thing was how the world rearranged itself around me. Old neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years started popping up with sympathetic nods and advice. A former student, now a teacher, sent a quick text offering to come by and help with odds and ends. A neighbor from the duplex across the street lent me a ladder for a day. The universe, it turned out, is full of small kindnesses that cost nothing but time. As the days turned into a week, the fight sharpened into focus. I told myself I wasn't doing this to be cruel. Cruelty is easy. Justice is hard. My intention was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was a reassertion of dignity. It was a reminder to a family that built its life on a foundation I had poured my sweat into, that there are debts that cannot be paid with a smug smile. They had taken more than they realized when they treated me like trash. They had taken my memory of Lillian, my late wife, and put it in a place where it would be trod upon. That was something I could not abide. I went to bed most nights with a plan rolling under my thoughts like a slow wheel. There would be hearings and filings and notes to keep track of. But I had something else now too, the satisfaction of agency. There is an odd power in being forced to use your wits. It turns worry into work, and work into progress. Leonard might have his friends and his confidence and his expensive sweaters. He did not have what had kept me alive in the long trenches of loss and age: craft, patience, and the equally stubborn machinery of quiet insistence. On the second weekend after the Thanksgiving nonsense, I drove by their house. From the street, I watched them through the curtain. Leonard and two men I guessed were friends, laughing in the living room. Henrietta moved like someone in a walled garden, polite but contained. The table, our table, sat under the window. It looked smaller through the glass, like a thing being observed rather than used. I felt no gloating. I felt something like pity. It was a cold, honest pity for people who thought they could build a life on someone else's goodwill and never expect to be called to account. Simmons that day, Martinez called with a scheduling notice. There would be an initial hearing, procedural, he said, but important. He wanted permission to serve papers and possibly to ask the court for a temporary order, preventing any transfers until the title was clarified. "This is when they get to respond," he said. "They'll be surprised." No, they wouldn't. People like Leonard are never surprised by the law when the law moves slowly. They are surprised when the law moves, full stop. They don't expect a man they've humiliated to stand and answer with the deliberate language of court and counsel. They expect rage, perhaps, or tears. They do not expect the quiet, steady arm of procedure. That evening, I sat at the table and polished the ring of a coffee mug until the ceramic shone. I did not allow my thoughts to become vengeful fantasies. I prepared as builders prepare. Measure twice, cut once. The house, their house, my house, was a structure of lived moments and legal documents alike. I intended to exercise my part of both. There remained personal things I knew would sting, seeing my daughter's face when the summons came, hearing Leonard's excuses as they tried to explain their way out. There would be neighbors who would take sides. There would be the whispering of people who liked simple narratives, the old man driven by spite. I anticipated those whispers and did not let them have me. On a cold Tuesday morning, I signed the paperwork Martinez slid across his desk with a blue pen. He had the courthouse stamped copies in an envelope, and when he handed them to me, he said one last plain thing: "You're ready." It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't encouragement. It was fact. Pensions. Threats. I got into my truck and drove to the post office, where I slid copies of the filings into an envelope and mailed them, certified to Henrietta's address. I didn't do it to humiliate her. I did it to start a process that would reveal truth. If humiliation followed, it would be a byproduct of their choices, not my design. Driving back that afternoon, frost had melted into a brittle slush. I thought about the Thanksgiving plate again, the way Leonard had placed it down like an insult and expected me to eat the scraps of the life he had helped himself to. I thought about how easy it is for people to believe that time erases obligations. It doesn't. Time only makes them quieter. Chapter 2 ends not with the rattle of courtroom gavel, nor with triumphant music. It ends with the slow, sure tightening of a plan finding its edges. There will be arguments and there will be hard days. There will be moments when anger flares and when disappointment threatens to topple the careful scaffolding I had built. But I had learned that the work of reclaiming is not dramatic. It is stubborn. It is the grinding, steady application of one small fact against another until the whole false edifice begins to shift. That night I slept in my small apartment with the windows cracked a little to let the cold in. The air smelled of old coffee and sawdust, comforts in their own way. I closed my eyes and saw, briefly, a different Thanksgiving in my mind. One where my daughter met me at the table with her hand outstretched, honest and ashamed, and where we ate pie and laughed and told stories about Lillian. I did not dream of revenge. I dreamed of repair. But sometimes repair must begin with a correction, and corrections can be sharp. Tomorrow the court clerk would stamp our request. Tomorrow the papers would start to circulate. Tomorrow, the house that had almost forgotten its builder might remember again. The morning of the hearing arrived with a thin, brittle sun that did little to warm the sidewalks. Frost rimed the edges of the courthouse steps like powdered sugar on an untouched pie. I sat in my truck for a long time, hands folded around a paper cup of coffee that had gone tepid. Martinez was calling from his office, calm, clipped, a man who never let his voice wobble even when things were complicated. "You, ready?" he asked. Invoked. "I'm ready," I said. The words felt simple but true. My stomach did a small flip, the kind you get before you pull a board and see whether the wall will stand. This was a procedural hearing, he'd said, a first step, but it could set the tone. It could slow them down long enough for the facts to get traction. Clang. Authorize. The courthouse together. A small room with high ceilings and a radiator that clanked like an old clock. The judge, Judge Halverson, a woman with quick eyes and silver hair pulled tight, kept her robe from talking. Court clerks moved like ants, precise and indifferent. Martinez filed the packet with a practiced hand. The defendant's counsel, when it came, looked like he'd been recruited from a glossy legal advertisement. Expensive suit, neat tie, the kind of man who could say, "Objection," and make you feel as though you'd missed an important step. Imientos. Leonard did not show, at first. That surprised me. I expected him to storm in with bravado and a prepared speech. Henrietta did not come either. Instead, a woman in a suit took the stand for them. She was their lawyer, their armor. The judge listened to Martinez outline the case. The quiet title request, the confusion in the deeds, the registered transfer involving a shell LLC, the lack of notice for certain actions. Martinez's voice was even, relentless in its facts. He slid the copies of canceled checks across the bench. He pointed, gently, to evidence of my continued investment. Payments for roof repairs, for gutters, for the furnace the winter Lillian took sick. He presented photographs of the table's scratches, of the banister where Henrietta had carved her initials when she was 7. It felt theatrical in a small, solemn way, because the past had to be rendered legible to a courtroom that cared for signatures more than memories. Shimmer. Sentenced. Their counsel objected occasionally, technicalities, phrasing, the performance of details. The judge let most of it stand but flagged the registry questions for the clerk to follow up on. It was slow, legal work, a current moved through narrow pipes. Still, when the judge granted a temporary restraining order preventing any transfer of the property pending the quiet title action, I felt something like a small bell ring inside me. Not victory, yet, but a halt. Seizing. Shields. After the hearing, in the hallway, I watched people go about their lives. A father holding a toddler, a couple arguing quietly. Legal matters are often painfully ordinary. I caught sight of Leonard across the corridor. He'd finally turned up. He was leaning against the wall, jaw clenched, mobile phone to his ear. For a moment his eyes found mine and flared, then looked away. He didn't approach. He had not wanted a scene in the courthouse. He had wanted to humiliate me in my own home, not in a place where paper mattered more than loud voices. When we left the courthouse, Martinez suggested we not go to their house that day. "Let the papers do their work," he said. "He'll be smarter if he feels the pinch through process, not spectacle." I agreed, partly because spectacle was not my way, partly because I liked the slow effect of the law. It was austere. It hurt where it should. Over the next week, the quiet title action unfolded like a patient animal that does not hurry but is steady. Martinez led the discovery process, subpoenas for bank records, inquiries to the title company that had processed the transfer to the LLC, requests for any documents bearing signatures that might show intent to transfer ownership. I was engaged in detail, reading statements, signing declarations, calling neighbors who might testify that I had maintained the property, served repairs, paid for utilities. The legal team worked like a machine built for patience. They pushed back, of course. A title company representative said that oftentimes transfers involve complex corporate entities created for tax or estate planning, and that it wasn't necessarily malicious. Leonard's lawyer sent a curt letter warning me against harassment, implying that my true motives might be petty. The first bait was the comment about my age, implied like a slur. He suggested that perhaps I was using the courts to settle personal grievances. That stung, until Martinez reminded me that people with power always try to rewrite the moral framing of a fight. If their story painted me as a spiteful elder, it would deflect from the exact, mundane proof Martinez was assembling. Then came a discovery that changed the game. The LLC that appeared to have some recorded interest in the house, Blackwater Holdings LLC, had links to a management company that listed Leonard as a manager on some internal documents. It wasn't enough by itself. Paper can be slippery in how it names roles, but it suggested involvement. Martinez dug deeper and found that some payments to the mortgage company had been redirected through accounts that bore signatures similar to Henrietta's. The handwriting matched in slant and loop. It meant that the family had a tangled paper trail they hadn't fully thought to hide. We collected emails showing late notices, invoices for repairs they had not paid, and copies of a letter sent to a P.O. box in another county listing an agent unknown to me. I sat in Martinez's office the day he walked in with those documents, and the room smelled faintly of toner and cheap coffee. "This is good," he said. He didn't say it with triumph. He said it with the kind of weary relief one gets when a map starts to show the roads. "Will it be enough?" I asked. "It's enough to keep the case alive and to show a pattern of behavior that a judge will consider," he answered. "It's reason to proceed with depositions and interrogatories. This is the kind of paper that makes litigators lean in." We served notices. I watched as the family's lawyer began to respond, sometimes with evasions, sometimes with the careful provision of partial documents that didn't quite answer the questions asked. That's how people with something to hide behave. They answer, but not in ways that reveal the whole. Martinez would prepare a follow-up. I'd sit and wait, my chest a steady metronome. Meanwhile, Life outside the legal landscape crept on. Neighbors watched more closely, eyebrows creased in private judgments. A woman who'd lived 3 doors down came over with 2 pies and a quiet apology for not calling sooner. "I didn't know he could be like that," she said, wringing her hands. I accepted the pie and the apology with a small nod. She wasn't trying to take sides. She was trying to stitch something back together in her mind. At home, I continued my practical preparations. I checked the chain on my back door, repaired a loose step, bought a small safe and put in important documents: birth certificate, marriage license, copies of deeds. The act of gathering those papers felt like packing a small private ark. Martinez told me to keep duplicates, originals in different places. "You can't win a long fight without redundancy," he said. The day the depositions were scheduled, I felt an odd combination of dread and clarity. Depositions are strange affairs. Answers are sworn, but the setting lacks the ritual weight of a courtroom. They are like rehearsals with consequence. I sat across from Henrietta at a conference table, and for a moment she looked exactly the way she had in old photograph. Thin face, cheekbones shadowed, hair pulled back in a practical knot. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the long days of parenting and everything to do with the slow wearing out of internal moral certainty. "Henrietta," Martinez said, soft but precise. "Please state your name for the record." She gave her name. He asked about payments, about who had paid the mortgage in recent years, about communications regarding transfers or estate matters. She answered with the clipped precision of someone coached or terrified. The questions went on. At one point, Henrietta said, "We thought we were handling things responsibly." Her voice faltered. It was the first raw moment of the deposition. No one behind the glass cheered. This is not that kind of story. But in that falter was a crack. Leonard's deposition was postponed when he claimed a work emergency. That was unsurprising. He'd been trying to operate on the rhythm of inconvenience, show strength where it served, hide when it didn't. As the interrogations piled up, a new piece of information surfaced, one I'd not expected. An accountant who had worked on their household finances 20 years ago called me. He'd been friends with Lillian in the neighborhood, and he had a habit of calling old clients with the kind of updates retired people find boring. He told me, in a voice that suggested he felt a need to be honorable, that there had been an arrangement years prior to create an LLC for rental property they intended to keep for tax reasons. Nothing criminal, he said, but sloppy paperwork had created room for ambiguity. The more you dig into people's intentions, the more often you find intent tangled with ignorance and oversight. That did not excuse anyone's cruelty, but it suggested the truth was not entirely black or white. Sometimes injustice grows out of small bureaucratic rot as easily as it grows from malice. One chilly evening, I got a call from Martinez that made my hands clench. "They've filed a counterclaim," he said. "They're saying you've been trespassing, that you've interfered with quiet enjoyment, and they're asking the court for damages for harassment." The words landed like a fist. Of course they would flip the frame. Of course they would try to make themselves the victims. It's a well-worn move. "We'll respond," Martinez said. "We'll show the certified letters, the dates of service, the fact you asked for accounting, not spectacle. The filings are defensive, expected." He paused, then added, "They'll try to muddy the water. Don't let it get personal. Court it personally." Their lawyer's letter had a tone that implied I was the one causing unrest, that I was a bitter old man with a vendetta. But I had been careful. I had been precise. And precision is the weapon in a fight where the other side believes rhetoric is stronger than record. Crimson words spread, as words do, in small, efficient networks. Leonard's friends began to uninvite him from certain gatherings when they learned there were legal filings. People are pragmatic. They don't like being close to courtrooms if they have no business there. It was not the grand isolation I might have imagined, but a subtle erosion of the social scaffolding that had propped them up. People who once laughed with them now declined to attend a holiday party, citing prior commitments. The network frayed, unleashed. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a bank, an ordinary envelope that felt like an ambush. Inside was a notice of a lien being placed to secure unpaid taxes on the property. It wasn't a dramatic foreclosure notice, but it was a legal weight laid on top of the house. A visible, pesky thing. Martinez suggested we use it in court to show that there had been negligence at the very least. It wasn't revenge, it was evidence. Retribution was not my aim. Restitution and truth were. There were moments of quiet cruelty in this period too. Little tests designed to get me to shout or to produce the spectacle that would make them sympathize. Leonard once parked his biggest truck in front of my apartment and played an alt-country song loudly for an hour. Another time, a landscaper cut the old maple in my yard down to a stump. I called the city, and their permit check confirmed no permit had been pulled. Little things like this are the way people with privilege try to throttle those who challenge them. I documented everything: photos, dates, witnesses. A neighbor wrote a note to the city condemning the cut. Another neighbor offered to testify that the tree had been planted by my wife. The net of small kindnesses had grown tighter than I'd expected. And somewhere in the middle of the paperwork and the small hostilities, my daughter called. Her voice, when it came, held an odd mixture of exasperation and fatigue. "Dad," she said, "this is tearing us apart. Can't we just sit and talk? Not lawyers, just us." I had been waiting for that call. For a moment, I considered what it would mean to drop the case, to go back to being the man who laughed things away. The temptation was there, like a warm blanket on a drafty night. But Leonard had not asked to sit and talk. Leonard had humiliated me with a plastic plate on my own floor. Henrietta's silence that night had been a choice. If a conversation without consequences could repair that, maybe I would have taken it. But talk without accountability erases truth. "We can talk," I said, "but the papers are already in motion." There was no way to go back to a world where the humiliation remained unanswered and the legal record unexamined. "Please, Dad," she said, voice small. "I don't want to lose the house. I don't want the kids to." Her words broke. She didn't finish. I could imagine the scene. Two small grandchildren playing in a house drawn into the slow teeth of litigation. I felt a sudden, sharp ache. Litigation takes lives it touches and reshapes them in ways you can't always undo. "I'm not trying to take anything from the children," I said carefully. "I'm trying to make sure what Lillian and I built isn't quietly stripped away without notice. If we can find a way to do that without tearing the family apart, I will. But we live in a world of paper. Paper is what I was given, and paper is how I'll answer." There was silence on the line for a long minute. Then she sighed. "Just be careful, okay? Don't let this make you cruel." "I won't," I said. "I'll be precise." By the time Chapter 3 closed, the story had hardened into an axis of facts and filings, depositions, the temporary restraining order still in place, a counterclaim that would have to be addressed, and an emergent pattern of the family's financial indifference. It was not a triumph yet. It was not revenge yet. It was teeth, the slow bite of legal process beginning to take hold. That night I sat in my apartment, opened an old tin box, and took out a small square of fabric that had been Lillian's, faded at the edges, smelling faintly of lavender. I touched it for a moment, then folded it carefully and put it back. The fight was a long one. It would be measured in motions and responses, in docket entries and service of process, in small vindications and the occasional setback. But I had found a rhythm, and with it, a quiet power that felt like my own. Out streetlights hummed on. In the distance, someone laughed, a neighbor, unaware of the paper wars 2 houses down. In the hush of my apartment, in the small glow of the lamp, I planned the next steps. More documentation, a motion for summary judgment where appropriate, aggressive yet measured counters to their attempts to paint me as the antagonist. The world had a language, legal language, and I was learning to speak it. Where Leonard had relied on mockery and control, I relied on facts and patience. Where he had assumed that time and silence would keep him safe, I had used them as instruments too. Quiet, steady, inevitable. And in the corner of my mind, beneath the legal vocabulary and the filing dates, a simpler idea grew. Dignity is not a thing you wear. It is a series of acts. Each letter mailed, each photograph taken, each sworn statement filed was a stitch in a seam that would, eventually, hold. There are moments in a life when the world, which has been a set of murmurings and small indignities, arranges itself into a single, crystalline action. For me, it happened on a Wednesday in late December, when the sky was that particular leaden blue that makes windows look like dark mirrors. I had slept poorly. The apartment felt smaller than it had the night before. Perhaps it was because the fight had finally acquired a name, possession. And named things have a way of feeling heavier. Martinez called early, his voice steady as always. "We've got the court order," he said. "It's provisional, but clear. The temporary order stands, and the court will allow a writ of possession if the defendants refuse to vacate voluntarily. I recommend we coordinate with the sheriff's office and use a neutral moving company. We do this by the book." I said nothing for a moment. The air in the kitchen smelled of cheap coffee that had sat too long. The idea of a mover in my own house felt like a strange fiction until the paper sat in my palm. Stamped, dated, real. I folded it and slid it into my wallet like something you carry to prove you still live. "You want to come by together?" Martinez asked. "Yes," I said. "At 10. I dressed deliberately. No theatrics. A wool coat, sensible boots, a cap. I wanted nothing in my appearance to make them think I'd come looking for a scene. The whole point of this day, my point, had been to replace mockery with procedure, spectacle with fact. If anything, I wanted the moment to feel as ordinary as closing a book and setting it back on the shelf. When I pulled into the driveway, unfamiliar cars were already parked at bad angles, exactly like the ones the night of Thanksgiving. My heart tugged at the sight of them. I parked a few houses down and walked up slowly, as though the pavement itself might throw me off balance. There were 2 sheriff's cars, a small Dodge moving truck, and a locksmith's van. Deputies in standard olive uniforms spoke in low voices by the front steps. A man from the moving company, stocky, practical, stood beside a clipboard and nodded at me when I approached. He had the tired, professional look of a man who'd seen too many people in transition. Leonard stood on the porch with his arms folded. He looked the way smug people look when they're trying very hard to project composure. Jaw tight, lips like a thin line. The same expensive sweater from Thanksgiving, gone gray in the morning light. Henrietta stood a few feet behind him, her expression a difficult map of fear, shame, and something like resignation. The children were in a neighbor's car, I later learned, kept away from the spectacle by someone who had the decency to intervene. "You got the papers?" Leonard said, voice sharp. The deputy stepped forward, polite but firm. "Mr. Turner, we have a court order. This is to effect possession. You can choose to comply voluntarily, which will avoid a forcible removal." Leonard's eyes flashed as though he wanted to answer with a slur or a sneer. Instead, he said, "This is theft." It was the rhetorical move of people who feel entitled to rewrite reality with a sentence. "It's not theft," Martinez replied calmly. "It's enforcement of a legal right. We have the documents, including a temporary order preventing transfers pending the quiet title action. You were given notice. You have the option to remove your belongings in an orderly way. If you refuse, the deputy will carry out the writ." There was a tense pause. Leonard looked at Henrietta as though waiting for her to say something, anything, to make him right. She did not move. Her hands were folded in front of her, fingers worrying at the hem of her sweater. Her eyes flicked to mine for a second, then away. "Fine," Leonard said at last, the words like a dropped flag. "We'll go through the motions." They moved slowly, the way people do when pride is being packed into boxes. I watched as they carried framed photographs off the wall, the family faces that had once smiled back at me in earlier times, now being bundled into blankets for transport. There was a peculiar, helpless grief to watching your past leave the place you'd made it. I did not gloat. I had not wanted this to be theatrical. but neither did I pity the truth away. One point, Henrietta lingered by the table. She ran a hand over the wood grain the way someone touches the surface of a memory they aren't sure they are allowed to keep. I had watched her do that as a girl, tracing knots and lines like stories. She looked up at me, voice small. "Dad, can we talk? Please. This isn't what I wanted." I remembered how she used to drag her chair up to the workbench when I built a birdhouse, the sawdust in her hair, the intensity of a child learning to make shapes matter. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gulf with 100 apologies that I had kept stored like loose change. But what had been done required rectification as well as warmth. If I forgave the instrument of her silence without consequence, I would teach her, perhaps cruelly, that silence and complicity were acceptable prices to pay for comfort. So I answered, carefully, quietly, "Roofing. We can talk," I said, "but words without action are not enough this time. I need to know you will not sign away what is mine and what belonged to your mother without clear accounting. I need proof." Her eyes filled. We thought we were doing the right thing. We were trying to keep the house out of probate, to manage taxes. Silenced. By putting it into shell companies? By letting payments slide? By laughing when your husband humiliated me? The last words found purchase like a notch on a long-forgotten beam. "Shill." She looked away. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "I know," I said. "Then let's make it right." By noon, the movers had loaded a few pickup loads. They were careful with the table, wrapping legs in heavy cloths. Leonard watched from the curb as his friends carried boxes into the moving truck. A neighbor, the woman who'd brought pies weeks earlier, stood by with a thermos of coffee and a face that read sorrow. "I'm sorry it came to this," she said to me. "I wish things could be different." "Still." "So do I replied. I spoke it plainly because I meant it. A part of me hoped, even then, that at some point reconciliation would be possible without the erasure of responsibility. As the day unfolded, people from the neighborhood drifted to their cars with quiet concern. Some watched openly from windows, others pretended not to notice. The movers worked methodically. There was a rhythm to the removal. Armload, box, blanket, truck. Every object leaving the house had its own small story. A chipped plate, a child's drawing pinned to a magnet board, a broken lamp that had once lit late-night talks. As they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they were just leaving the house had its own small story. As they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck, as they brought the last pieces to the truck. Besides learning, from Wings, was happy. Last pieces to the truck. Leonard finally approached the deputy. "You can't take everything," he said, hopeful, as though law could be bargained with pleas. "We're taking what's on the premises," the deputy said. Anything that is furniture or personal property may be removed by the owners. The court has ordered possession of the property itself. It does not prohibit removal of personal items under supervision. Leonard's face crumpled with frustration and something uglier, the recognition that he had misread the map. He had been counting on inertia, on time, on the aged hands of a man not willing to contest. But I had contested. I had brought the law's patient winter to bear. When the truck's load was nearly full, Leonard stood in the driveway and shouted the old thing again. "You've taken our home, missions. He was never solely yours," Martinez said, voice even. "There is a difference between possession and title, Mr. Turner. The court will sort through ownership claims. Right now we are enforcing a temporary order. You can't make us leave." Leonard's voice had the panic of a man realizing his life's construction had weak points he'd ignored. "Sir," the deputy said quietly, "we prefer voluntary compliance, but if you refuse, the writ will be enforced." No one wanted spectacle. That was obvious in the careful speech and the avoidance of physicality. Still, the air felt heavy with old grievances and new practicalities. I carried the table's protective blanket inside. It sat in the truck like a small shrine wrapped in canvas. Henrietta came to me once the truck was nearly gone. Her face was wet. I saw tracks on her cheeks where mascara had fallen. "Why do you have to be so strict?" She asked it like it was an accusation toward an old heater that wouldn't budge without someone prodding its valve. "You asked me to be present," I replied. "You asked me to protect what we built. If that makes me strict, then perhaps I am." Her hands twisted in a movement I remembered from years ago, the way she used to tie apron strings. She looked at Leonard, then back at me. "Please," she whispered, "think of the children." I did. I had thought of them the whole time. That was another part of the ache. The small ones who would inherit stress they hadn't earned, who would come to Christmases with boxes instead of warm places. I wanted to protect them from a world that often made grown people fight over small things. But the children did not choose the adult choices that had led us here. They were victims of a grown-up economy of decisions. When the truck had finally pulled away and its tailgate lowered with a tired clank, the house looked different. Not empty, but raw. The table that had been the scene of the Thanksgiving mockery still remained, wrapped now and placed outside beside the truck. The front steps, which had held the weight of a family's comings and goings, were bare. The windows reflected the sky like cold eyes. People often think reclaiming something is a swift, cinematic triumph. It isn't. It is practical and bureaucratic, and sometimes brutal in its ordinariness. The deputy handed me a list of items inventoried by the movers. Martinez handed me a small packet with instructions about how possession would be logged and how I could secure the property. "Do you want us to change the locks today?" the deputy asked. "Yes," I said. "Please." We did. It was small, a mechanical click and turn, but it felt like sealing a book after writing a heavy page. The locksmith worked with a professional's calm, fitting new hardware without flourish. He handed me the keys. They were cold and metallic in my palm, but they were real. As I took the keys and stepped inside, the house smelled like dust and lemon, cleaner, and a faint trace of perfume that would never be mine. I walked through the rooms deliberately, touching surfaces, checking the television for any damage, noting the scuff on the wall where a child once leaned too hard with a crayon. In the kitchen, I paused by the counter where Henrietta had once left a note for me to pick up milk. Old habits are stubborn ghosts. Lem watched from the sidewalk like a man watching a boat leave harbor without understanding the tide. At one point, he put his hand to his mouth and shouted something I could not quite make out. It sounded like a collection of accusations. I did not answer. There was nothing to say that would aid the truth. Inside, I set the coffee mug I had been drinking from on the counter and walked to the dining room. The table, our table, remained wrapped and quiet near the back door. I had built that table, yes, but the memories layered onto it were many and communal. I ran my hand along its edge and felt the old grooves. The house seemed to exhale. For a long time I stood there and let the exhale be heard. Came in then, quietly, as if afraid of making the house upset further. She sat at the edge of the kitchen chair, hands folded, eyes on her knees. "Will you let me stay?" she asked, soft, raw. "For a little while? I'll, I'll help untangle this. I can fight it. I just need time." I looked at her. I saw the daughter who used to trace wood with a small sticky finger. I saw a woman who had been overwhelmed by choices she did not fully understand. I thought of Lillian and how she had once said that family is not simply about proximity, but about the actions you take when someone falls. I could see a path that included both justice and mercy, though it would not be easy to walk. "Henrietta," I said slowly, "I don't want to take your life away from you. I want accountability. You can help that. You can start by being honest with the court, with us. We'll do the legal work. You can do the hardest thing. Tell the truth." Her shoulders trembled. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "Try," I said. "That's all I ask." Outside, as the sun sloped toward an early winter evening, I placed a single white plastic plate on the porch step where Leonard had placed it months before. It was symbolic, and perhaps childish, and maybe someone would mock me for it. But I wanted him to see it, to remember how small the moment had been that had sparked this long, precise reclamation. I filled it with scraps from the kitchen drawer, an apple core that had gone dark, a dried biscuit. It was not cruelty. It was a reminder, a quiet mirror. We had been given the choice of how to treat each other. He had chosen contempt. Henrietta watched me do it. For a moment, her eyes met mine in a way that was not wholly broken and not wholly whole. There was a recognition there, that the act had consequences, that the law was a blunt tool laid over an older, tender moral machinery, that homes are assemblages of both wood and promises. That night I slept in the house I had reclaimed for the first time in months. The rooms felt different at night. They were less like places and more like things that held memories. I lay awake for a long time thinking about what would come next. Depositions to complete, a trial date looming like a storm horizon, the small practicalities of collecting what remained of their belongings should the court rule in a way that required further action. I also thought about Henrietta's children, about how a child's Christmas might be less festive with boxes in the parlor. I thought about Leonard's fury, about whether rage can convert easily into regret, or if pride calcifies into something like stone. I did not want to be the man who used the law to extract pain without purpose. I wanted them to learn accountability in a way that didn't wreck their children's lives. There were calls to make. Martinez had already set a schedule for the next hearing, and the court clerk had given a tentative date. I planned to introduce more evidence, to push on the LLC connections, and to ask for financial disclosures that would show exactly how funds had been diverted. It was the slow arithmetic of accounting that would do more than any shout. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, the house settling around me with small creaks and the distant hum of the highway. I had wanted, for a long time, to be seen and treated like the person who had built a life, who had loved and labored. The day had been a legal confirmation of that desire, but it had also been a moral reckoning. People would whisper that I had been cruel. Others would say I had been slow and patient. The truth was less tidy. I had felt my worth injured and chosen to seek repair through the instruments available to me. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its quiet momentum. Someone down the street yelled at a dog. A porch light flicked on. The house, with its new locks and its reclaimed key, stood steady against the evening. Inside, the table waited, rapt and patient, like something that knew its time would come again. And for the first time in a while, when I closed my eyes, I could imagine a different Thanksgiving in the future. Not the one in which humiliation sat on the floor like a plastic plate, but one where the table was full with conversation and accountability, where the children could play without the shadow of secrecy. The path to that future was long and would be littered with court days and hard conversations, but the wheels were in motion, the papers stamped, the deputies respectful. The uninvited guests had been made uninvited by the very law that binds our small communities together. 4 ends with the house quiet, and the knowledge that the next stage of the work would be the hardest, transforming the legal win into genuine repair, if repair was still possible. The movers had gone, the keys were in my pocket, and the plate remained on the step, a simple reminder of what had been and what was at stake. Winter had settled into the town like a gray blanket, each morning bitter with frost, each night brittle with the scent of wood smoke. The house, now fully back in my hands, felt different, not only reclaimed, but transformed by the process. The echo of footsteps, the hum of the furnace, even the faint creak of the floorboards carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. Every corner, every wall, whispered the story of labor, memory, and now, justice. Chiropractic through the dining room where the table had sat, wrapped in protective blankets. Unwrapping it slowly, I traced the grooves and scratches I had made over 30 years. Small reminders of work and life, of laughter and sorrow. It had survived chaos, just as I had survived the humiliation, the Thanksgiving of shame, the months of legal maneuvering. Each mark told a story, and now it was mine to protect again. Henrietta came that morning, quietly, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. She lingered by the kitchen doorway, hands folded, eyes downcast. Her voice trembled. "Dad, I don't know how to fix everything," she said. "You start with honesty," I told her gently. "Truth doesn't erase the past, but it prevents future mistakes. You can still help make this right." She nodded, small and careful. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. The first step, perhaps, toward accountability and understanding. Leonard watched from the street. His friends had disappeared, the laughter gone, leaving only the shadow of his earlier arrogance. He had lost control in ways he hadn't anticipated. The law had moved more slowly than mockery, but it had been far more effective. His face betrayed a mixture of fury and disbelief, not at me, but at the consequences of his own choices. Battlefield would come back soon. I thought about them in the holidays. I wanted them to see their home as a place of stability, not a battlefield. I would protect that innocence, even if it meant drawing hard lines with adults who had failed to honor the past. As I walked through the rooms, checking locks, securing documents, and organizing the remnants of the upheaval, I felt the long shadow of Thanksgiving past lift just slightly. Not entirely, because memory cannot be erased. But the house was mine again, my labor and love intact, my dignity preserved. That night, sitting by the fireplace with a quiet cup of tea, I reflected on the months of legal action, the careful accumulation of evidence, the patience required to fight without losing composure. Revenge had not been loud or vengeful. It had been precise, measured, deliberate. In that precision lay a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from seeing someone humiliated, but from restoring balance where it had been broken. I thought of Henrietta and her role in the silence that had cut deeper than any insult. I thought of Leonard, of the arrogance that had underestimated both law and patience. And I thought of the table, sturdy and familiar, a testament to years of work and a symbol of resilience. Tomorrow would bring more paperwork, more court hearings, more conversations with lawyers and deputies. But tonight, the house was calm. The furnace hummed steadily. The windows reflected the winter moon. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the kind of peace that comes from standing firm and knowing you did not compromise what was rightfully yours. The Thanksgiving of humiliation was over, and in its place, a quiet reckoning had taken root. One that would guide the family, perhaps painfully, toward accountability, honesty, and eventually, reconciliation. The world was still imperfect, and some wounds would remain, but the house, my house, was finally secure again. Justice, I realized, does not need to shout. Sometimes it only needs to arrive quietly, steadily, and let the weight of truth do the rest. For this chapter completes the arc with resolution and reflection, emphasizing justice, accountability, and the emotional closure of reclaiming what was taken.